LCS awards for the summer split of 2016 are obviously about to be announced over the next month or so, with the all LCS teams being announced this Wednesday on Primetime League. The coach of the split announced the week after, August the 17th, the rookie on August the 24th, and then the actual MVP of the league, EU and NALCS, will be at the LCS Summer Finals weekend, which is the 27th to 28th of August. And so with the regular portion of the split having finished, and essentially the performances being locked in, and now people ready to mull over who's the actual MVP, I've already seen quite a lot of discussion over who it should be. And so with the MVP, Most Valuable Player, being the most important award in many ways, it's supposed to honour the player who's not just the best player, because you can obviously be the best player having the best performance, but overall had the best performance over the entire league. And then, obviously, it's a very variable term. How do you judge which one's the most valuable? You know, there's lots of different ways you can go with that. So it's always an interesting discussion in most sports leagues to talk about who the MVP is. And I've seen a lot of discussion over who the MVP should be for the NALCS summer split this season. So first and foremost, one thing that I think is a big problem when it comes to MVP discussions is the way people demand a consensus. Like, it's one thing if they think someone is the best player, or they have a set amount of they have some criteria they can lay out. Like, I think these are the qualities you need to have the best. And so in each of these areas, this is where I see this guy value. And so overall, I give my vote to this person. That's one thing. But people not only want to put forward their opinion on who the best is, but they demand it become this consensus. And they demand the notion that there is a consensus, and that there always is a consensus. And this is a big problem for me, because as someone who's watched not just esports, but many traditional sports for many, many years, it's very, very rare that there ever is any sort of a reasonable consensus on who the actual MVP of the league is. Even in the past, when there were very dominant players and players who run fantastic teams, you can usually find someone making a very credible, very legitimate case for another player to be the MVP. Because when we're talking about the MVP, the best player, there are nearly always some incredibly fantastic players who at least can be considered in their own ways. And so it's very rare that you can just say this one guy is not only the best player, but he's the obvious consensus. He's the only player who could be the MVP right now. I think he's the MVP, and therefore no one else is even allowed to suggest anyone else. And and then you can always tell the people who are like very rigid and narrow-minded in their thinking this way, because they'll always just say stuff like, if you say someone else is the MVP, they'll go, oh, you obviously didn't watch the games. You know, that's sort of like a very fallacious argument. They won't even go down to the brass tacks of, what are your criteria? How do you debate this point here? Here's what I think on this one over here. I value this more. Why do you value? The actual interesting parts, the meat of the debate, is what never gets got to. Instead, it's just, here's my opinion. No other opinions are valid. And not only that, hopefully a consensus of people agree with my opinion. And then anyone who thinks otherwise is obviously an idiot who doesn't watch the games, doesn't know about League of Legends. And we all agree, at least we're all bound together, that we all know that this guy, it's a fact, scientific, empirical fact, that he is the best player and was the best player. Now, the point here to make is, part of the reason why you can't have this set consensus, aside from the fact, like I said, there's different criteria and we all value them differently in general, is that when we're talking about team sports, which is what MVPs are for, then you've got to look at the fact that it's a team game as well. How good your team is in terms of individuals affects your success. How good it is as a unit affects your success. How good the style of players that play around you is. You might have very good players, but the style might not be the best for you. Or within the certain style you're playing in, if you like Duke on SK Telecom, for example, you're not going to be emphasized all the time in the way that Marin was on the SK Telecom in 2015. You're a secondary carry compared to the Faker and Bang of the world. And so you're not going to be the MVP. If your team's the best, odds are you can't be the MVP. You could be the best on a team like he was in the past on Najin, where the team's not that good, but you're the best player by far and they play around you. Sure, you could have this. So as a result, there's a lot of factors to go with when you're deciding who the MVP is, which is what's funny, because in other games where you have people who are media who vote on this stuff and who's been around for 20 years, that actually you find even in those games, there's no absolute consensus and there's no obvious name that is apparent and obvious to everyone that suggests itself every season. That's why actually, in terms of building the narrative, there are journalists in other sports who, to me, use bullshit narratives themselves. Like, criteria doesn't make any sense for me. Like, I'll give you an example. In the NBA, famously, they not only are obsessed with the win rate of your team record, despite that you could have been the best. So logically, you could be the best player of all time in the NBA. You could score like 60 points a game on 55% shooting, but you could have such a terrible team around yourself and a team that doesn't play the style that works for you and a coach that mismanages the team that you finish like 8th in your conference, and it's now impossible for you to win the MVP in the NBA, in the current NBA. That would never happen. Instead, they're going to give it to someone who's on one of the top 4 teams in the league. You have to have a very good win rate overall, and then even worse, when it comes to MVPs, they use this criteria, this logic, which I'm just using to point out to you how bad even mainstream media can be, which is they will often use the logic of who actually won the big key game in the season where the 2 MVP candidates met each other. They'll use that. So famously, one of the reasons why they said Kobe Bryant was the 2008 MVP over Chris Paul from the New Orleans Hornets is actually because he won a crucial game that they played against each other at one point in the season. And so people actually said that this is the reason why. Well, that's not the reason why. If he was the MVP, I agree he was. Then it was for other reasons. His overall body of work over the season. It's how he played within the context of his team, numbers he put up, the performances he had, and depending on the difficulty of the schedule. You can take win rate of the team in if you want. I don't think that has to be the biggest one, though, myself. And so I think that's a bullshit criteria. I hope people don't do that in League of Legends. Now, a problem we have in League of Legends, aside from people demanding this consensus and essentially having like groupthink where you're not allowed to have a different opinion, is I really think League of Legends for MVPs is suffering massively from role bias, where people don't seem to understand the context that if you are really a godlike support player, you can be the MVP of the whole league. Even if, in theory, you're not a traditional carry role. So yeah, the guy getting all the kills and doing all the damage on your team isn't going to be you, is it? Because you're the support. Likewise, if you're the best jungler of all time, you absolutely could be the MVP of a whole league, despite the fact, in theory, obviously, you need the help of your carries to get worked in. You need the help. You can go to a lane and get ganks for people all day long, but unless you have good carries, your team's not going to win. Therefore, your team's not going to be at the top of the league, and therefore you're going to end up in some hell like Dandy and Vici Gaming, or Spirit when he was in World Elite, where he was absolutely one of the best in spring of 2015. So, role bias is something I think people really need to think about in League of Legends and not just look at who does the most damage, who gets the most kills, because one area that I see as really, really bad is, to me, the most obvious role balance in League of Legends, bias in League of Legends when it comes to MVP awards is mid lane. Because here's the thing, mid lane can have sick outplays 1v1. Mid lane gets jungle help to get ahead in the lane. This whole thing that people will always use, which will make mid lane bias, aside from the fact that mid lane never gets as hard banned out or balanced in general as top lane or ADC has in history, the other traditional carry roles. Aside from that, which always means that these mid laners are always vibrant, always vital, always effective in the game to some degree, there's also this notion that people use that like the mid lane affects the map because he's the carry role that can roam more than the others in theory. I mean, technically you make the case that since top lane can teleport, he can affect the map in his own special way, but that's more of a team coordinated thing. So they'll always say, oh, mid lane, if he gets the advantage, he can then transfer the advantage to other parts of the map. He can roam top, he can roam bottom and take part in extra ganks, etc. He can help out with the support when that roams up or the jungle comes down. Sure, you're right. He can, in this sense, he has the advantages at his position to affect the map more. But this is actually just role bias. That is within the remit of what that role can do. There are other areas that every other role in the game can also affect the game massively itself. A support can obviously roam in its own way, but how does he take care of his laner in the lane at that point in time? Does his team need to get ahead in the 2v2, in which case they can't roam as much? It's not as simple as just say that because he's in the middle of the map, he can affect the map more. Well, obviously he can, but the question is, within the remit of doing that, that's his job, one of the aspects of his job, a sub-criteria, does he fulfill that criteria? It's not just because he can do that, he's automatically better than the best top laner ever, or the best ADC ever, just because he's in the middle of the map. I think that's a bullshit reason to use, because we all know these other roles can be massively impactful as well. I mean, just look at Hooney last year to see what obviously a guy as a top laner can do without being and have a huge impact across the whole league, and how everyone has to play from being in that position. We look in the past at great supports, Mata, Madlife, etc. Obviously the junglers, Diamond Prox, Dandy. We can go right down the list all the way. Every position in League of Legends should be possible to be an MVP from. And I think if you judge it reasonably and don't just unfairly skew it by that logic of like, well, he can affect the map in the way the others can't. Great. Well, then by that logic, we get back to the old fallacious argument that like anyone who's really good and a shot caller automatically is better than any other player who's really good at that position but not a shot caller, because being a shot caller affects the team more. Sure, it does, but this is an individual award, and that's not a reasonable criteria to always go to. Otherwise, you're going to end up with 3 people who can never be the MVP in a specific sense just because you've taken one criteria and put it above all others. So here's the thing. Shot calling and affecting the map, obviously they're good qualities to have in a player and can definitely make you a very valuable player. But does the other qualities of the other player outmatch them? Is he so fantastic good in one area that he outmatches something like that? This is something you really have to think about. You've also got to consider Like, to me, that's why the most hard done by position in the whole game. I used to say it was top lane, because obviously my favourite player, Flame, for literally a year of his career, where he was still an elite level, all-time great player, 2014, was in a position where, thanks to the composition of his team and the fact that top lane couldn't carry in the same sense, was in a position where he essentially couldn't be the MVP of a league, couldn't be a world champion, couldn't even qualify for a Worlds, mainly because of his role being limited by the game and by Riot in the meta. But I actually think if you look at the history of the game now, I've got to put AD carry up there, actually. I think how long and how often they've been hard done by. Now you look at the AD carry now, it's so rare people will acknowledge that the AD carry can be the best player in the league, can actually be the MVP. People look at it like, oh, you just did your job in lane there. Oh, you just did your job last hitting champions in the fight. Oh, you just did your job outfooting damage. We are an AD carry. No, this is the remit of the AD carry. This is what he's supposed to do within his job. So is he the best at it? Is he doing such a fantastic job at his position of AD carry relative to your team that he's actually making your team the best and that he's the MVP? Is in this particular sense, is this the way it's working? I mean, you look at it, one of the reasons why I actually think in this sense, people were very unrealistic is because they talk about like, okay, so the mid laner affected the map more. Okay, well, the AD carry not only has to do his job in terms of farming up for the mid to late game for the fights to have the items and potentially to be ahead of the other AD carry so that he can be in a position to do a lot of damage, but also he has to stay alive to be a threat later in the game and not the other AD carry get too far ahead. And then thirdly, he has to work with another player in his lane at all times in order to get to the end of the game. He has to work with his support. Well, so for example, in the case of someone like Doublelift, when people are saying Bjergsen affects the map more, sure, he does in terms of that specific criteria. But for example, Doublelift is working with a brand new player to the pro scene, Biofrost, when he used to have Yellow Star in that spot. So he's working with a brand new guy and he's playing incredibly individually and he's playing well as a team. And then he's helping all of that aspect, his lane, then affect the whole game more. So you look in other sports, and it's true, there are other sports that have this kind of nightmarish scenario. The best example to me is the NFL, obviously, because they have such a massive hard-on for quarterbacks, which I realize they affect the game a lot. And in that game, obviously, the other players don't really pass, so I get that it's a very, very vital role, but they have such a hard-on. They are way too in love with the quarterback position. I mean, unfortunately, you could go into a lot of like kind of fucked up social aspects of that, like the fact that the quarterbacks are nearly always white in the past. And all that. There's a lot of aspects you can go into that I'm not going to go into right now because it's not about the NFL. But you see an overwhelming tendency to give the MVP of the league to a quarterback, and if they get to a final, unless some other position massively outperforms the quarterback of the winning team, the quarterback is just going to win that award for the finals MVP in the Super Bowl. That's just going to happen, unfortunately. And so as a result, to me, it kind of spoils it, because you get some fantastic players at other positions who are incredible and who at least deserve to be considered, and realistically, they never were going to win. I mean, you look at a guy like JJ Watt, who's a godlike defensive player, he's just not going to win the award. It's almost impossible for him to, because there's going to be another quarterback at some team in the league who has a very good record and is playing very well and is probably going to win it in most scenarios. Now, a great sport that I want to compare to League of Legends, because I see it as similar in some sense, is the NBA, because I think the NBA is a fantastic sport for parity of MVPs. If you look over the last 17 seasons of the NBA, all 5 positions of the game have won the MVP. And that's not because they try to be diverse and just we gave it to power forward, shooting guard last year, so we got to give it to a power forward to make it diverse. No, they didn't use some bullshit political correctness or modern day social justice warrior bullshit. Literally, they did what I'm describing here. They looked at what the position is supposed to do and what the general approach of that position is. Then they judged each player within the context of their position and then the whole league. And as a result, different times in history, you could have Kevin Garnett be the MVP. You could have Steph Curry be the MVP. You could have Shaquille O'Neal be the MVP. You could have Allen Iverson be the MVP. You could just go down the list. Kevin Durant. You could have all the positions covered as you go down. You could have point guards, obviously Steve Nash. And so that's what's great. Is to me, it really was, if you were the player who played the best, they took into account what your position was. Now, I admit, as I've said before, they used some bullshit criteria for the MVP there, but I like the fact that in theory any position can win. So I hope this can be the case in the LCS, and I especially hope I'm bringing it up for this year, because I do feel like, unfortunately, these natural biases and these kind of like fallacious arguments, in as much as it's not that they're all fallacies that are being applied, it's just that people are just taking their own criteria and making out like it is the only criteria. No, What happens is, the reason why there isn't a computer that can tell us who the MVP is because you can't just look at the stats on their own. You have to have a human to interpret the stats. Likewise, you can't just look at stats. You have to look at their play and qualitatively judge how well they played a situation, whether they got the kill or not. And then you have to also consider all the criteria of what the qualities that make up a good player is and what this player played well in. Then you have to say, which will I judge against each other? What was offset here by having a better teammate? Oh, was this a coaching aspect that helped with this aspect of how he played? You got to judge all of this. Then at the end, you can come up with your MVP. And we could have 3 or 4 names and it could still be very legitimate for all of them. And yeah, I might think it's this one. You might think it's that one. Doesn't mean someone's an idiot though. And that someone didn't understand the game and is a cretin. That's a very, very poor way to think about things and won't get you very far in life because you won't hear new and interesting things from other people that think differently than you. So in this particular split of the LCS, I'll put forward 3 candidates that I think are all very legitimate in their own right as the MVP of this split of NALCS. So first and foremost would be my vote, and that is Doublelift from TSM, the AD carry. So one of the things I think has been great about Doublelift is he's had another fantastic individual split, but he's done that in terms of just the pure, I'm the AD carry, I kill people in my lane, I do damage in my lane, I don't lose my lane, I go to the late game, I kill people in team fights, I get kills, I play safe, because at least in the late game he did play safe when he had proper teams around him. You do this, and then you win the game. In terms of that basic job of the AD carry, he's done a fantastic job again. But you know what? He's done that in the past as well. Spring 2014, I thought he was fantastic in that role. I thought by the time in 2015, they got the team together. In fact, all of 2015, I thought he was very good at this position as well. I thought his team let him down at times. And then obviously they got it together with the better lineup for the summer last year. I think he's had that type of season before. What was different for me this time is that in CLG, when he started to win in that summer split, sure, I saw some changes there. But I have to say, I put a lot of it down to like good coaching, maybe even some of the mind game with Weldon stuff where Weldon supposedly worked with him and helped him with his mentality a little bit. That's a small area, but we'll put that into the mix. Maybe it helped. Third detail, I've got to say, it felt like Afromu taking charge more, being more of the shot caller, coming from Doublelift's lane, working with him. We know Doublelift in the past had been at his best when he was Chowster, who's the guy who led him in lane and told him what to do and told him how to interact with the team. I put a lot of it down to these factors as well as him being this fantastic individual player. So that bump up in terms of success, I didn't put it all on Doublelift's back. You know, I always thought he was a fantastic player anyway, as I've just outlined, and already an MVP level candidate at his position in the past. But the key detail of this split for me is that now when you see him take his advantages in lane and extend them across the rest of the game, first of all, it's not that he extends them as in he's just a witness, he's just doing what people tell him in the mid game. Then he gets to the late game where every great AD carry knows how to play and then dominates there. So it's either in lane early game or it's late game in the macro team fights. No, what's great now is now he takes these advantages out of lane, and now in the mid game and the early to mid game, he makes correct decisions that aren't just laning decisions of when to group, when to go somewhere, what to do at a certain point in time. You hear, I don't buy this thing that he's like the shot caller. I certainly think though he makes good calls within his position and context of his position related to the group. I certainly think he could be making good decisions there. And then later in the game, if he's a key threat in a late game team fight, he should be making certain calls based on the fact that he might know where he needs to position himself or where we need to go to get a fight for him that'll work for him. So I think in this sense, he's transitioned those advantages and made that aspect of his game a lot more than just being the very good individual AD carry in a way that we hadn't seen in the past. And more importantly, there is no Afromu type asterisk to say, well, he's got this guy with him who probably told him something or seemed to have that effect to bring him out of him. Now he's working with Biofrost, a rookie. So actually that's part of the reason why I see so much more from Double of this split and why I think actually he's the best player on TSM. I also think, in general, you look at it, now his mid-game is fantastic. That's why I always thought he had the issues before. That's where he could lose you a skirmish. That's where he would sometimes make a weird decision in terms of like the purchase he'd go back and get. Like he wasn't on the same page as the rest of the team in terms of where they thought the game was heading. That's where sometimes he could be kind of off message as it was. But now it seems like he's much, much more on point in that particular sense. Now, I think the next candidate, and a very, very viable one, is Bjergsen from TSM. Now, again, this isn't just because these teams are the best, but it's the other way around. Because these two guys, Doublelift and Bjergsen, are having all-time great splits for themselves, the two of them together on the same team is why this team is one of the best of all time from NA. So you look at Bjergsen, I mean, even just the stats, this is one stat that's great. He's got 11 champions that he has wins on this split. fantastic. He can pretty much go everywhere in the meta. He has all the meta champs. Then he has the meta champs that are the off picks. Then he has the ones that just come in every now and then, like Malzahar or something. He'll just take that and bring that into the game. And as a result, where the fuck are you going with bans here? I mean, Double have basically broke the ban system anyway, because it just became a waste of time to ban these champions out. Just let him fucking have them and try and take something away from the jungler or the top laner or something. So in this sense, Bjergsen's been absolutely insane in terms of versatility. Again, obviously mid lane plays more champions than other roles, so we're only viewing that compared to the other mid laners. We're not viewing it versus the AD carry or the jungler, etc. Obviously, as I mentioned before. I think in that sense, he's been fantastic. As usual, his skills have been incredible. Now it seems like his team works around him before. I always thought a problem he had in the past was trying to be the shot caller. I actually thought limited his game a little bit, took away from what he could have done individually. So having a better team around him that seems as a group to understand the game better, and it's not just one shot calling voice, has meant that he has to shot call less. And as a result, he works better within the system, and the system also works around him. He doesn't have to make weird decisions like this game. I'm just going to play Lulu because now I don't feel like I can play this carry champ. I have to set up a comp so that someone else can do well, shot call for that, and play safe in this point. And we don't have to do any of that shit. Now Bjergsen's unleashed to just be Bjergsen, which is what we always wanted to see in TSM, but at certain times in history we didn't, and unfortunately we got on with those whack times of like MSI 2015 where you had to see him on Cho'Gath and shit like that. That just wasn't what you wanted to see him at that time, when you could play fantastic champions that he could have carried the whole game on himself. So he's absolutely been one of the best in the world. I still think he's a very, very good player. I think I can understand the arguments of people who think he's MVP. Personally, I picked Double for this split. I think the third name that probably is going to go undermentioned because of how fantastic TSM's record is, the fact that people are just obsessed over those two players, and they're all biased, meaning that it goes to Bjergsen in many people's minds automatically. I think the name you have to mention as the third name is Reignover from Immortals. And the reason why is because in the past, I thought last split rather, in the spring split, I could understand why people thought he might be a candidate for it. But I thought no, because at the time, the difference between Huni and the other top laners was still so significant. It's like, dude, this guy's the MVP. Like, Huni was the real reason why Immortals smashed that last split in the regular season. He was just so much better. The timing of when he would make plays in the game was so incredible. He could just have such a huge impact by himself. Well, we haven't seen that Huni this split, actually. He has not been dominating in anywhere close to the same fashion or anywhere close to the same style, even in terms of the impact that what he does in the game then has on the whole team of his side having an advantage, and then the opponent being discombobulated. That doesn't happen whatsoever in the Immortals games. They're a good team. Now it's the team aspect that's strengthened more than it is Huni individually. But the thing that's stayed consistent is how much of an impact Reignover has. Obviously, in terms of how he moves around the map, he's going to define the style of Immortals anyway. And in the past, he defined it by how he worked with and facilitated Huni. So that's why I always gave the nod to Huni in that sense, because it was the carry. Yeah, he got a lot of help, but they did a lot with the help as well. Now, this guy still gives the same sort of help, still facilitates, but helps the whole team. And that's why I think if you look at Reignover and you look at the good season that Immortals have had, a massive amount of it's been due to him. So I think he's a very legitimate candidate. So you can see there, my three picks, I haven't picked them just to make this point, but you notice I've got an AD carry, I've got a mid laner, and I've got a jungler. I think these are all absolutely legitimate names to put up there. And I think if any of these three win, I don't think you can feel hard done by. You can make a case that you think it should be one of the others. I think they're all very legitimate, and I hope in the future that we can avoid this role bias. Because even in history, you look at guys like Michael Jordan, Wayne Gretzky, these all-time great players. It's not the case that it's just obvious they're the MVP every season. Even in some of their seasons where they won, you can make cases for other people. You could have different criteria by which you judged others. Interestingly, people like Michael Jordan actually won when their teams weren't close to the best in the league. Funnily enough, we're not allowed to do that in other leagues, it seems, or in esports. But I think these are all things that should be considered, because you can definitely debate who the MVP is.